Thank you. I believe we are good on technical difficulties. At some point, we'll all be able to do face-to-face hearings again, and that'll be a good day for that. So thank you. Thank you as well for Chairman Sinema for holding this hearing. It's incredibly important for grid reliability. We've got to be able to make sure we have adequate energy supply. As many as you may know, last year in Oklahoma and much of the country, especially in all of the plains area in the Midwest, faced unseasonably extremely cold weather, and all the winter precipitation that challenged our grid and energy supply left many people in the dark in the coldest time of the year last February. I frequently say that Oklahoma is the Saudi Arabia of winds. It's about 40% of our electricity comes from wind annually. But during that period of time last February, despite all of our wind infrastructure, wind fell off the grid like a switch had been flipped. Meanwhile, coal, which usually is less than 20% of our generation, shot up to provide over 50% of our power. Oklahoma is truly an all of the above energy state. We have wind, we have solar, we have hydroelectric, we have geothermal, we have diesel, we have natural gas, we have coal. It's very important to us to be able to maintain that type of energy diversity for us. And I'm very interested in the issues that happened last year, where we have weaknesses in our system, and how we can actually learn from that. There's a lot that we still need to be able to go through in the days ahead. As I'm watching what's happening in other parts of the world right now, for instance, in the UK, their prices of energy have shot up dramatically. They're reducing reliability. What's happening in California right now, they're having reliability issues. Even China is battling an energy crisis right now, where they're dropping their energy usage across all of China and trying to be able to deal with certain provinces, only certain days that they can actually use power. So it's a very significant issue that's happening worldwide. And I want to be able to track and see how we in the United States can make sure that we can maintain power, maintain reliability for the protection of human life in very cold and very hot days, but also for consistency and actual economic development, manufacturing, all the things that are also important to us. There's been some consideration for renewable energy tax credits. What that looks like in the days ahead, I hope we'll have an opportunity to be able to talk through some of those things. As I've already heard mentioned, some of the permitting issues that are out there that are very significant, because none of these projects begin and end in a year. We have to be able to deal with basic distortions in our system as we look on the horizon and see, are we over accomplishing some areas and not using some others for our energy development. So all these are issues I hope to be able to address today as we deal with the responsibility this particular subcommittee has on energy diversity for our nation, and how we can protect our nation and our economy with a diverse energy portfolio to make sure that that is stable. So Chair Sinema, thank you again for leading out on this. Look forward to the ongoing conversation in the hours ahead. Thank you, Chair. Let me go through quite a few questions, because I'm going to kind of drill down on several issues that are here. But Mr. Nickel, I want to begin with you. Obviously, the issue of diversity of fuel sources has come up several times. Try to figure out how do we make sure that we have a diversity of fuel sources. So if we have a problem with one, we have availability in others. We've had a lot of conversation about wind and solar. Obviously, making those more resilient has been an issue. We can make this more resilient, but they're always going to be intermittent. There will be long periods of time, especially in the central part of the United States, where we'll have days without a lot of sun, and we'll have days that will have less wind, as they're experiencing right now across Europe and in UK, causing some of those issues there. So let's talk a little bit about diversity of fuel sources. What do we need? How do we know when we've overproduced or we're over reliant on some sources that are more intermittent?
Well, thank you, Ranking Member Lankford, for that question. It's an important question, and I think the observation is very real and accurate. Diversity of resources is very helpful. None of us would invest in a single stock and plan on that stock to be our retirement plan. I think the same thing can be said of generating resources. The more diversity we have, the more we can count on being able to deal with any number of different events. This winter, we were able to count on all of our diverse resources: gas, coal, wind, hydro, nuclear. It all produced, and to some extent, a lot of it produced at a much lower degree than what we had hoped and expected based on our studies. That's the real issue. The real issue is not whether we need less diversity or more diversity. What we need is to be able to better understand how that diverse portfolio of resources is expected to operate during these varying conditions, whether it be wintertime conditions, summertime conditions, fall or spring. That's our job, and that's what we need to do a better job of going forward, is better understanding what to expect from that diverse portfolio of resources.
Let me drill down on a couple of things on that. One is you had mentioned before interconnectivity, obviously with other regional transmission groups. So you stated for Southwest Power Pool there was enough interconnectivity there. So I have two sets of questions there. Is that true for the other RTOs, that they have enough interconnectivity? We obviously had 4 hours, as you mentioned, of time that was downtime. So it was clear we weren't able to take in enough during those time periods, or the other RTOs were not able to be notified fast enough to be able to get it over. Obviously, Texas has a different issue there with it. So the two sides of this. One is, where does that strengthen us to have more connections, or do we have enough connections? And the second part is, where does that make us more vulnerable to have more connections with other RTOs?
Well, as I stated in my testimony, we were very blessed, and we realized a lot of value by the virtue of having the interconnected capability we did with our neighbors. Now, SPP is a region that operates in what is referred to as the Eastern Interconnection. The other interconnection is the Western Interconnection. That's where Madam Chair receives her energy from, the utilities that operate in the Western Interconnection. And then you have the majority of Texas that operates in an interconnection known as ERCOT. By virtue of being in the Eastern Interconnection, and by virtue of having tremendous interconnection capability with our neighbors, we were able to have access to hundreds of thousands of megawatts of generation to the extent it was available, and to the extent the transmission system was able to deliver it. So just because you have interconnection capability doesn't mean you have transfer capacity. And that's what really helped, is that we had enough transfer capacity to be able to import at times 6,000 megawatts. If that had been continuous throughout the entire 7-day week, we would not have had to shed load. Unfortunately, there were a few times where the transmission system on an intervening system was just simply not able to deliver that power to us at the 6,000 megawatt area or level that we had been able to rely upon for most of the event. So without that capacity, we would have seen a lot worse of a situation. We would have had to shed a lot more load. It could have looked more like what ERCOT experienced if we hadn't had the benefit of interconnection capacity. Now, could we use more of it? Absolutely. But that has to be determined and assessed on a cost benefit basis. One of the things that we've got to do a better job of when we value the investment decisions that are being made, and we're determining the benefits of those, we've got to do a better job of understanding the value of resiliency and the increased resiliency that is available and afforded to us by transmission expansion.
I know this is going to be evaluated all based on costs, and in my second round of questions, I'm going to have lots of questions for some of the other folks that are here on the panel, so I appreciate your insight as well. But Mr. Nickel, I want to drill down on one other thing. There's been a lot of conversation about the natural gas side of things. When I talk to the natural gas folks, they'll say they were electricity power dependent, that once they lost power and it rolled off for whatever reason for them, the wellheads froze, they weren't able to produce, and they weren't able to send natural gas, then to do more electricity generation, which made the problem even worse. And it became this circular event where when they lost power, then they lost capacity to be able to send, and it became a bigger issue. One of the issues there is identifying those locations where, if you have to be able to pull some spots offline, hospitals, for instance, nursing homes, that your wellheads and your places that are actually sending natural gas to your generation would also be in that list. Is that in conversation right now? Where does that stand?
Well, Senator, it is in conversation right now, and we are really embarking on that learning exercise right now. And one of the things that I think has got to happen, we've got to do a better job of, and that is we got to communicate more. The gas industry, the electric industry has to get together at the table and talk, and we haven't done a good job of that in the past. And that's why you are hearing, and other people have heard, similar comments and similar explanations for why gas didn't perform. I know anecdotally, based on some of the things I've heard, that there is some evidence that occurred. it's certainly not the whole story, and it's certainly not the primary cause of the gas failure in SPP. Nevertheless, the more we can talk, the more we communicate about how to work together more effectively, the better chance we have of resolving the issue, the right issue, and answering the right question with the right solutions.
What would you say is the primary cause on the gas failure there for SPP?
In SPP, what we know is that there was a lack of fuel supply, and we believe, based on information that our market monitor has produced, is that it was a combination of two things. Gas just simply wasn't available, and or gas prices were too high. Those were the two leading drivers of the gas unavailability. Again, having said that, I also know that there are situations and worse situations where gas wasn't available because its electric service was shut off. I mean, we do know that that happened. We just don't think that that was the largest contributor to their lack of availability.
Chair Sinema, can I just stretch this into one more question there just to close the loop on this?
Sure, of course.
So the issue on the gas side is a really important issue in trying to be able to determine dependency on this, where this goes. Right now, I don't know what the standards are for any of those that are producing electricity on what amount of gas they're going to do by contract in advance, what they're going to purchase on spot price, and what they're going to do in storage that they have on for a quick capability on that. What's the typical formula? Now, I know in SPP it's going to be different state to state and how that's handled, but the issue of how much gas is available on contract, what the price is going to be in spot, obviously, and as that floats from day to day, and what they've actually got on site will matter, and how much that they're able to use in those peak moments. What's the basic formula for those three?
Well, I wished I could give you a better answer than what I'm about to give you. So let me just apologize in advance. SPP does not have any rules or criteria around how much of that gas should be purchased on a firm basis or on a non-firm basis, as you refer to on the spot. What we do expect is that if a gas-fired generator is going to be counted as accredited capacity, that it does need to have firm fuel supply during the period of time that it wishes to be accredited. So it's kind of, if you want to be considered valuable, you must do this. But it's really a choice that the generating utilities make regarding how they pursue that question.
So the challenge becomes then, if you get into a crisis moment where everyone's trying to get more natural gas, the spot price dramatically increase, and we'll come back and talk about that later. That becomes a pretty big issue if you don't have enough storage that's available to you, and you're fighting with everyone else to be able to get access to other things. You do have a critical gap that's there on very cold or very hot days. That what is your reliable power? That's not intermittent at that point. If your intermittent goes down, your reliable power is now not reliable just based on access to the source. Am I tracking that correctly?
Yes, absolutely. And you become much more exposed to really high gas prices, which is exactly what we saw in February and what drove a lot of our energy prices in our market to record high levels.
Well, this seems like a solvable issue in trying to be able to establish how much we're going to have to do on contract to have as a firm commitment there to be able to come in, because natural gas is not something you can just turn on more of at an instant, and trying to figure out how to be able to get more out. And then if you have the snowball effect with everyone else is going after it, especially when Texas was so desperate at that point, and so many people that were selling south at that point, it becomes a much bigger issue. Chair Sinema, thank you very much for the extra time there. Particularly, I want to be able to follow up with one last question on this. There was a lot of conversation on the price of natural gas during last February's storm. You brought that up as well. So there are a lot of market features that are there with supply, demand, the contract, the spot price, all of the storage, as we talked about before. But I have an odd question for you that I hope there's an answer to. How did it get to that price, the final price that it got to for natural gas? Why was that the final price? As y'all were dealing with the different costs for natural gas during that time period, how did it get to that spot?
Well, Ranking Member Lankford, I don't know the answer to that question. There are certainly a lot of anecdotal pieces of information that I've been shared, but I don't know the whole story. I have heard that that the lack of supply created the demand. I've also heard that the willingness of generators and utilities to pay whatever they could afford to pay in order to reliably serve load also contributed. But I can't tell you to what extent either of those drove that price as high as it did.
That's one of the features we're going to have to determine at some point. Obviously, ERCOT was ready to pay a pretty high price to be able to get some natural gas. It drove up natural gas prices everywhere else when people were dealing with it. If there's one area that I think you and I need to be able to follow up on, it's this process of what's the combination of contract firm price, spot prices, and what's the dependency there, and what percentage will be there, what amount of storage has to be there, and then how do we manage the price? Obviously, I'm not one for price controls in this process. I do know our electricity has some price caps that are in it. We've got to be able to figure out how to be able to manage that long term, because we'll have other peak events, both summer and winter events. And this will be in different regions as well. And the lessons learned from last February would be helpful to other RTOs across the country. Mr. Bryce, I do want to be able to drill down on something you had mentioned before about nuclear power, and we've got to be able to get that as a power source ongoing. That's not happening right now with small modular or nuclear power. The reasons I hear most often is the cost and the investment there, but the capital that's required to be able to do that initially. And the second issue has become the permitting, that no one wants to put $8 billion forward to be able to prepare for a nuclear power plant if it's going to take 15 years in permitting, and the uncertainty of who will be president and what the rules will be when they actually get to that spot. Is that correct? Not correct? What do you think is the reason we're not seeing more nuclear power at this point?
Well, Senator, thank you. I think you've hit on those exactly in the right way. That as Ray Rothrock, who's a veteran venture capital investor, has recently said, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and the federal government present, in terms of the licensing, an uncontrollable risk for investors who want to build new nuclear plants. And that long term, the length of the licensing process is a gigantic hurdle. And so we've also have the recent experience of the nuclear plant in South Carolina being canceled. The plant Vogtle in Georgia is over time and over budget. I think that it's clear as well that those plants, and generally speaking, are just too large. We need smaller reactors that are going to be lower cost, that we can build at scale and do so quickly. And I've written quite a lot about this. I've had several guests on my podcast talking about how do we scale up and a new nuclear manufacturing sector in the United States. Robert Hargraves has a company called Thorcon. His idea is to fabricate them in shipyards. But if I may, to revert to your question back to Mr. Nickel, I'd like to make one point on the gas grid and the electric grid. In August, I published a piece in the Dallas Morning News about what happened in ERCOT. And I made a point in that piece, and I want to reiterate it here. The natural gas grid and the electric grid in the United States have merged, but they're still being regulated separately. And your point about maybe requiring or incenting electric utilities, electric generators rather, to have some amount of firm capacity, I think is part of the answer. I know the Public Utility Commission of Texas is grappling with these issues now, trying to figure out how they assure the on-time delivery of natural gas during peak events. But we have to also understand that one of the reasons why we had such a high peak demand in Texas during Winter Storm Uri is because over 60% of the homes in Texas rely on electricity alone for heating. So that peak would not have been as high if we had had more homes using natural gas. But I think that the fundamental issue in terms of that resilience, reliability, when it comes to natural gas and the interface with the electric grid, is that those grids have to be more closely regulated, or the regulation has to be intertwined, because those grids are interdependent.
Thank you. It's helpful. Mr. Urgot, I want to ask you the same question about the nuclear power and the permitting process there. You mentioned multiple different projects that are transmission projects that are quote unquote shovel ready, that everyone knows are actually not shovel ready out there, that they have been a decade or more in process, and they're currently stuck with competing federal regulations or competing federal requirements preventing them from actually go forward. Anytime I talk to anyone about nuclear power, they bring up the same issues. Why would I take the risk in $8 billion in capital if they can't even get transmission lines up and going across multiple states to be able to move? what do you see as the biggest barriers in the permitting side for nuclear?
Well, sure. So first of all, we have to desegregate the two discussions about whether or not wind and solar at any point in the future can provide base load by having energy storage, so it can meet the demand response at any given time. We're still years away from that, especially where the development of the projects are now that are stymied, even though there's billions in private equity and investor-owned utility and then public utilities that are putting money behind it. So when it comes to developing new nukes like we did with several projects while I was at the Permitting Council, it is even modest reductions in permitting times and increases in predictability and hard milestones had a direct relational correlation with a 2 to 3% increase in the debt and equity costs for these large owners, which are many times spread across multiple utilities. So at the bottom line, it's this. We have to be rational adults and look at the entire project schedule. The first 2 or 3 years are design and planning, the access and the supply to the fuel loads, especially like where Palo Verde and others in Arizona are still able to achieve those. And then there's the competing threat of whether or not after 6 or 7 years of developing a 700, 800, 900 megawatt nuke plant are the offshore wind plants that are going to be able to do 1.2 gigawatts and are going to have cables that are going to land into energy storage facilities, going to make this initial investment economically infeasible. And so we're in this notch period. All this frustration and policy about wind and solar versus natural gas, and everyone talks about above the board, all of the above energy solutions. We need it all. And the bottom line is, at the end of the day, our job, not my job, potentially those that are policymakers, is to remove the headwinds and let the market dictate where the energy price and the spot and demand markets are going to end up without manipulations. And although folks talk about the subsidies of the ITC and the PTC, that's about 2% of the benefit that can be a subsidy for a new plant. The 20-30% of project process cost that is borne on the backs of the eventual ratepayers is the big issue, and nobody seems to want to fix that. And that just ends up rolling off the backs of these utilities that pass it on.
Okay, Mr. Bryce, quick question on this. What do you estimate is the cost for new nuclear modular, and how many of them would it take to replace coal in the United States? Because I hear that frequently being kicked around, that we'll replace all the coal facilities with nuclear. And so I'm interested in what's the cost per of those facilities right now. We've already discussed the decade or more in permitting that it would take to be able to do each one of those. What's the cost for each one of those right now? And then how many would you actually have to build to replace coal in America?
Well, you're testing my memory here, Senator, but I think the goal should be for new nuclear reactors that they should be at par with new natural gas, which is about $1,000 per kilowatt. So $1 million a megawatt is, rule of thumb, generally speaking, for new natural gas-fired power plants. As far as how much the existing coal capacity in the United States, now you're really testing me, because our coal-fired capacity has been declining rapidly over the last few years. The last time I looked, I think we're consuming about as much coal for electricity in the United States as we were in the 60s, although the EIA just did say that we're going to set a new record high for coal-fired generation this year, as high as taking us back to where we were in about 2014. But I think we would need at least 200 megawatts, probably more, if we're going to, if memory serves, to replace existing coal in the United States.
So how many facilities would that be to do 200 megawatts of replacement?
Well, of course, it depends on what size reactor is deployed, sir, because now you have companies like Oklo are developing a 1.5 megawatt electric reactor, a very small reactor. Some of the other reactors are in that new scale. I've forgotten what that is, a 20 or 30 megawatt electric reactor that can be built in what they call a 6-pack, I think, configuration. But that's the key challenge, sir, is just what is going to be the optimal size for these new reactors, and what is the market going to demand? And I'll make one other quick point here, which is that what makes the entry of new nuclear into the market in the United States difficult is that electric consumption in the United States has been flat for 15 years. We're at a different point today where in the United States than where we were in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, when essentially all of the nuclear reactors in the U.S. were built, where we were seeing large, high single-digit increases in electricity demand in the United States. But over the last 15 years, despite population growth, electric generation in the United States has been flat at about 4,000 terawatt hours a year.
Okay, Mr. Price, let me drill down on one of the concern that we've all got and we're watching on this
Sure.
as well. Europe and in many parts of Asia, they're dealing with availability of electricity right now. They've had a pretty significant challenge in multiple different areas in Europe and across China. We're watching that. We're also watching in India in capabilities. What are the key features that you see there in Europe, China, India, but they do not have enough electricity right now to be able to supply demand? What do we need to pay attention to there to make sure we don't have that here?
Well, my response, sir, was I think what we're seeing is what I call the iron law of electricity, which is that, and this is based on what I've seen traveling around the world over the last 5 years, India, Iceland, Lebanon, Puerto Rico, New York, Colorado. People, businesses, and countries will do whatever they have to do to get the electricity they need. And so what we're seeing in Europe is a return to coal in a big way because natural gas is so expensive. We're seeing spot prices of coal in the international market now for the Newcastle benchmark at over $200 per ton, and in China, in some cases, over $300 per ton. We're seeing the deindustrialization across Europe because of a lack of natural gas. You see fertilizer plants being shut down, which will have knock-on effects in the slaughterhouses, knock-on effects in food supplies in the coming years because farmers don't have enough fertilizer. This is due to underinvestment in hydrocarbons. And now this is not a popular view, but this is the reality. The world still runs on hydrocarbons. And now we're seeing that without enough natural gas, Europe is in crisis, and it's affecting multiple industries where steel producers, aluminum producers in China are shutting down. We're seeing the knock-on effects of not a lack of renewables, a lack of hydrocarbons.
Thank you for that. That's helpful to be able to get a context on. Again, this particular subcommittee, we deal with the issue of energy diversity to try to make sure that the United States maintains a diverse energy portfolio that works and that is reliable and that's resilient enough to be able to manage it. We've obviously seen some gaps in our resiliency in multiple areas with blackouts and things that are happening in California, with what's happened in the Great Plains, in the Midwest, in the storm Uri last February, but we've seen in other areas as well. So we're going to continue to be able to work on this. Mr. Yonker, I have one last quick question for you as well, and I'm going to call you out on something. When there was a conversation on hydrogen earlier, I was kind of watching your expression as I'm watching through the Brady Bunch boxes that I have on my screen here, and I could see your expression when hydrogen was being discussed as well. Is there anything that you would want to be able to contribute as well on the issue about hydrogen?
I haven't studied it enough to have an opinion on hydrogen, but I certainly think that other grid flexibility solutions at scale ought to be getting prioritized. We talked about demand side management. We haven't really talked about long duration storage, which is stuck in early commercialization between labs and other areas. So I think there's some solutions from a grid flexibility and a grid reliability standpoint that need significant investment where the federal government can play a really important role. And this, in many ways, might be commercialization from the labs. This might be in grant programs like that are stuck in the approved but yet appropriated Energy Act of 2020.
Okay. Chair Sinema, thank you for the additional time in the second round of questions. I appreciate that for all the folks that are testifying today. We very much appreciate not only your written testimony that you submitted, but your oral testimony as well. And I appreciate your engagement on these issues. It's much needed in this season as we deal with a lot of very complicated issues right now.